Thanks, everyone, for joining us at the Project Censored radio show. We're very glad right now to be joined by Dr. Roy Casagranda, who is a professor of government and the Middle East affairs expert at Austin Community College. He teaches and researches at the intersection of politics, history, economics, psychology, and philosophy. Dr. Casagranda, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I want to start in the past, as one must if they want to understand the present. And I know that you obviously teach entire courses about this, so me asking to fit this into the first question of a 30-minute interview is just absurd. So listeners, consider this just the lightest of skimmings of the surface, and don't come at me for trying, to compress this. So because so much of our propagandization in the so-called West is based on Christian supremacy, both as the ultimate power, but also, of course, as the ultimate good, the shared histories and fates of like pre-modern Jews and Muslims is very purposely erased. So kind of honing in on the era of the Crusades, I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how the Crusades targeted, well, in reality, all three faiths of the book, so-called, including Christians inside of the Holy Land, but also how some of the first victims of the Crusades were in fact Jews, and how Jews and Muslims, who obviously had been living side by side in Jerusalem, were also collectively targeted by this belligerent and honestly rather slapdash invading horde.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah. So to start the Crusades, the first victims of the Crusades were actually the Jewish German community that was living in the Rhine Valley. Crusaders went up and down the Rhine, killing. I keep seeing different numbers on this, but somewhere between 2,000 to 6,000 Jewish people on the Rhine, and then raping thousands of Jewish women, and then they set off on the Crusades. And I guess their thinking was that this would get Jesus's favor, and I feel like they read a different New Testament than the one I read. Just don't know. I don't understand what goes through people's minds. So then you said slapdash. The first wave of Crusaders was actually sort of this peasant army, and it didn't have a lot of nobles involved. And they actually were raiding their way towards the Roman Empire because they were going to stage out of Constantinople if they're going by land. The ones that were going by sea were heading towards Venice or Genova, and then their plan was to take ships. But the ones going by land, they were heading to Constantinople. And eventually, the king of Hungary actually attacked them and destroyed that peasant army. And then the second wave of Crusaders coming through was commanded by nobles, and it was more structured. And they did pillage and raid, but the king of Hungary felt like he didn't have any option but to support them as best as he could. When they got to Constantinople, they were a mess. There's a lot of infighting, a lot of struggles, and they were officially allies of the Romans, but the Romans weren't sure what to do with them. And they crossed over into Anatolia. They didn't really start fighting the Muslims until they got to Antioch. And when they captured that city, they sort of set the tone for everything that followed. They fought. There was actually a battle against the Turks on the way to Antioch, but the first full scale conquest event was at Antioch. And they talked the Arab population in Antioch into surrendering with the promise that everybody would be spared. And as soon as the last last Turkish soldier, the majority of the soldiers were Turks, or there were Arabs there as well. As the last Turkish soldier dropped the last weapon into the pile as they were surrendering, the Crusaders drew their weapons and butchered every Jew and every Muslim in the city. They then proceeded to do this city after city after city until they got to Jerusalem, and then they did it in Jerusalem as well. When they captured Jerusalem, they went to the Jewish and Muslim quarters, because you have to remember the city was half Christian. There was 2 Christian quarters, a Jewish quarter and a Muslim quarter. And they went to the Jewish and Muslim quarters and just began slaughtering the population. There was one crusader, his name was Tancred. He did try to save some Muslims. He may have even tried to stop the slaughter in the Jewish quarter as well. It's unclear. He definitely tried to in the Muslim quarter. He had been there for other slaughters, so he had been there for Antioch. So this wasn't his first, but for whatever reason, he changed his position and suddenly became opposed to it. At one point, there was a group of Muslims that he came across, and he gave them his banner, and he said, use this banner when you meet other crusaders and tell them that you're under my protection. And then later he found his banner in their bodies. They were just slaughtered and were laying on his banner. The guy in charge was a guy named Godfrey. When he met with Godfrey, he asked, did we just do Jesus's work by burning the Jews to death in their synagogues and slaughtering the Muslims in their mosques? And Godfrey said, if we hadn't done this, at some point the Jews and Muslims would have staged a rebellion against us. We had to cleanse the city. And they sort of talked Tancred into going, okay, and accepting the massacre. It was too late, and there was nothing he could do about it, but he did at least briefly struggle. So I want to say, I guess I'm bringing Tancred in because I feel like it wasn't that 100% were on board with the genocide. It was like 98% on board with the genocide. And so one of the interesting things, of course, that the Crusades sort of brought out was that in the Crusader mind, Muslims and Jews were equally evil. Well, actually, I'll take that back. Jews were clearly more evil. And the reason I'm saying that is because when they captured mosques, they washed out the blood because there were a bunch of Muslims went into the mosques and were praying, hoping for divine intervention. But they figured at least they would die praying, it would help their souls. And so the Crusaders just washed the blood out, took the crescent moon off the minarets and stuck a cross and turned them into churches. In the case of the synagogues, they piled wood around and burned the Jews alive inside because they believed there was nothing you could do to cleanse the synagogue, that Jews were so corrupt that there was no way to fix it. So the only option was to just destroy it. Later on in the Crusades, there were lots of events that sort of, I think, illustrate the Jewish-Muslim relationship, but even the native Christian relationship to the Muslim population as well. A lot of the native Christians were split in the beginning. They were a little confused. Like, the Maronites were Catholic. So here are these Catholic invaders. And they're thinking, well, I guess we should support them. And probably as many as half of them were actively supporting them in the beginning. But as time went by, even the Maronites turned against the Crusaders because they just couldn't comprehend the cruelty. The cruelty was just beyond any way to make sense of it. Like, the Armenians, they're apostolic, they weren't Catholic, but they were thinking fellow Christian. So in the beginning, they were definitely supporting, and then they just realized this was not the path. When the city of Edessa was captured by Zenki, also known as Zengi, when he captured it, the city rebelled. Jocelyn tried to take it back, and when he did, that's part of the city supported him. So when they took the city back, Nur ad-Din took the city back, his son. When he took it back, he was like, okay, I need a population of people that I can turn my back to them. And I know that no matter what happens, I can trust them. He's a Turk, he's Muslim. He doesn't pick Muslims, he doesn't pick Turks. He picks Jews because he knew that the Jewish people were just going to be loyal and that he didn't have to think twice about it, but he wasn't sure about Muslim Turks. And so, there are these moments where you get to see the true relationship between those groups. Another one is Maimonides, who, was my favorite philosopher.
That's my brother from another mother.
Who doesn't love Maimonides? A 12th century philosopher. He was Saladin's physician. And, so here's the leader that defeats the Crusaders. Not completely, but he captures Jerusalem back, and his physician was Jewish. And it never occurred to anybody that was weird. That was how it was supposed to be.
Yeah, and I want to. I mean, in my dreams, I pretend that I'm related to Maimonides because my father's family is from southern, like Al-Andalus, and I pretend that we're related. But anyway,
I mean, that was 800 years ago.
I know, right? Yeah, I guess I'm also related to Genghis Khan and William the Conqueror too. So
Cleopatra.
Yeah, exactly. But I wanted to talk about Saladin because there's this stark contrast, right, about how he then approaches, even after all of this cruelty and the horrors that have been meted out on that population, he doesn't then say, okay, then I'm going to do an eye for an eye. Can you talk a little bit about how this stark contrast with how he then approaches ruling over the Holy Land as opposed to how the Christians had done it?
Yeah. So, okay, when the Crusaders capture Jerusalem, they massacre the Jewish and Muslim populations. They kill some of the Christians because they were Orthodox Christians, just so that they could tell the Christians, look, you're all Catholic now. When Saladin starts, he had a little bit of cruelty. Like there was, his career really starts in Egypt, and there were multiple events where there was at least assassinations. There was some nastiness that Saladin executed. There were some fights where he got a little bit rough. As time went by, you start to see him becoming increasingly more and more merciful, and he gets really humiliated in a catastrophic battle in 1177 at Montgizard. And I think that might have been like, if there was any cruelty left in him by that point, I think the disaster at Montgizard removed it, and it left him like this humble person who then from that point on starts to insist on a policy of relentless mercy. Like, I don't know any other way to think of it. So to the point where, at the Battle of Hattin, which is 1187, the Crusaders are destroyed. Their army, it's not completely annihilated, but it's 85% destroyed. One of the reasons why it's not completely annihilated is one of the Crusaders, his name is Raymond III, he's the Count of Tripoli, took a unit, and the Crusaders were out of water, so they were literally dying of dehydration. So they had to get to the Sea of Galilee to get fresh water. And Saladin's army is in between them and the Sea of Galilee. So that's the strategy Saladin's using, is I just got to keep them away from the water and I'll defeat them. And so Raymond III goes first, and as he's approaching the Muslim army, a gap forms in the lines, and Raymond III and his men get to the Sea of Galilee, get water, and they escape to Lebanon, to Tripoli. And of course, Saladin completely let that happen. Like, it's obvious that was his orders. And it was because by that point, Raymond and Saladin had become friends. But when the rest of the army is defeated and they surrender, Saladin does execute Renaud de Chatillon, but there's a real reason for that. Like, Renaud was a sociopath who was murdering innocent Muslims in caravans and on pilgrimages. And at one point, he was even plotting to attack Medina and dig up the Prophet Muhammad's bones and bring them to Jerusalem so that he could do sacrilegious things. And so Saladin's like, this guy, we can't show him mercy. He just simply needs to be removed from the equation. But he has the king of Jerusalem, and he shares ice water with him. And he says, I will never kill you. Kings don't kill kings. And then he spares the army, not the entire army. What happened was Saladin's army was very democratic. So it would vote on policies and then present them to their commander, the Sultan. And Saladin didn't rule with an iron fist. So he would go back to his men and say, look, I like what you said here, but I don't like this. And he would negotiate with them and try and create a policy that they could agree to and he could agree to. And after the Battle of Hattin, they came to him and they said, we want to kill all the Crusaders. Let's just massacre them and get rid of them. And Saladin was like, no, that's not us. That's what they would do to us. But we're not them. We are going to show them mercy, and we're going to release them. And they negotiated, and by the time they were done negotiating, they came up with, they would execute the Templars, the Hospitallers, and the Turcopoles. And Saladin then sent people who spoke Latin or French into the lines and told the men that were waiting to be executed, we won't execute Muslims. And hint, 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 go convert when you get to the execution. And a bunch of them did. We don't know what the percentage was, but 5, 10, 15, 20% of them went and converted in that moment and saved their lives. So even after they had agreed that some will be executed, Saladin was still undermining it and trying to prevent the execution. And then when they captured Jerusalem, the army doesn't want to execute the population because a lot of it is civilians. but they want to enslave them. And Saladin spends a bunch of time trying to, talk them out of this. They agree to a percentage of the city. I don't remember what the percentage is off the top of my head. Something like 20% would be enslaved, but they can buy their freedom. And Saladin is doing backflips trying to figure out how to get as many of that 20% freed. And by the time they're done, I don't remember the percentage, but 5-10% get enslaved and the rest are set free. And some of that was Saladin taking his own gold and buying the slaves and then freeing them. At one point, his brother said, I need 8,000 slaves for a project in Egypt. So Saladin gave him the slaves and then he just freed them on the spot. There was no project in Egypt. And so it was that kind of like, we just are going to figure out how to show you mercy. Having said that, there's a big critique of Saladin because that gave the Crusaders the ability to recover and form a new army and then start their campaigns again, and we get the Third Crusade. And yet, in the end, Saladin gets the Third Crusade to agree to a peace agreement in 1192. And I think one of the reasons why the Third Crusade ends in, giving up the idea of ever retaking Jerusalem and accepting peace was because the Crusaders realized they didn't have to fight. And the reason they realized it was because of the mercy he had shown them. And so, in other words, I think the Crusades died in part because of his relentless policy of mercy.
Yeah, the threat of a good example, I guess. And I think that the other thing that I thought of when you were talking was like, the ice water. People don't think of ice water being something that they had back in the day. And this also, to me, highlights how much of Muslim history or Arab history is erased in terms of their scientific. Now, it's not necessarily scientific to go up to a mountain and grab ice, but you know what I mean? Like the scientific, the mathematic, the creative culture that has been completely decimated in how we talk about it and reduced to this violent culture that in reality does not at all track with history. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about like how the extreme, and I want to get into, the later Crusades, the First World War and the War on Terror. But before we get there, I just want to ask you, like, how did we get to this place where so much of that wonderful collaborative history and culture has just been flattened to create this pancake of, quote unquote terrorism?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I mean, part of the mechanism to get to there was to deliberately not tell these stories from the Middle East. Yeah, the Arabs invented modern agriculture sometime between the years 750 and 800. So they did crop rotations, diversified crops. They looked for new crops, hybrid plants. What we think of as modern agriculture. They came up with the concept of private property. They lit up the streets at night with oil lamps. The first person to do the scientific method was Haytham, and he did it 600 years before Francis Bacon. He stated Newton's first law of motion. He stated Kepler's first law of planetary motion 500 years before Kepler and 600 years before Newton. He was doing calculus 600 years before Newton. Ibn al-Haytham also suggested that all objects in the universe exert gravity on each other, which to me, I don't understand how he got there because in our daily lives, we don't experience that. And he also identified that light had a finite speed and it traveled in waves, which again, like how did he discover this? Like, what was the process? He wrote something like 130 books, and I think we have 20 of them. So it's probable that the ways that he discovered these things was in the other books and we lost them over time. Ibn Sina invented modern medicine. He's a father of modern medicine. And, he's the guy who came up with 1,000 cures and then said, you know what, cures aren't that useful. If you just interrupt the transmission vectors, that's what's really amazing. That's what we should be doing. And so, so much of what we think of as modernity actually originates in that period. We usually refer to it as the Islamic Golden Age, and I'm not saying we shouldn't, but it's worth pointing out that age included Christian and Jewish philosophers from the Middle East as well. And there's no good term because you can't call it the Arab Golden Age because there were a bunch of Persians involved, So So we're kind of stuck. The majority were Muslim, so maybe that's the safe way to go in terms of name. But like Al-Farabi, one of the great minds of the time, one of his teachers was a Christian. And then, of course, we mentioned Maimonides, and it was this collaborative, multicultural, multi-religious attempt to make the world a better place through philosophy, through science, and also through poetry. Poetry played a massive role in all of this. Culture and art was taken to a new level. It was a golden age for sure in many ways. Having said that, it's also worth pointing out that it was also a period of extreme economic disruption and political disruption. The Arab Empire collapsed not long after it was created. And then each empire that replaced it usually collapsed within 100, 150 years. So all of these innovations and all of these discoveries and all these incredible things that are happening are not happening in a stable period. There's enormous chaos. And I think that's also one of the interesting things about this is that it's not couched in the period of comfort and or opulence necessarily. It was a period of chaos to a degree, and yet somehow Shia and Sunni and Christians and Jews all got along and made it work.
Yeah, and I think it's just really telling that, when you learn about those dates in history, at least for myself in Sweden and the US, it's the Dark Ages, right? It's not a golden age. We don't talk about that. We certainly don't talk about what was going on in China, or it's like it's all very much like in the world as it existed just in Europe.
The sun went away, and so it was very dark
Exactly.
for 1,000 years. Which is horrible because it also undermines Europe. Like it makes Europe look like it had just fallen apart. And yeah, it wasn't like there were a lot of scientific discoveries in that time period. I mean, it wasn't a time period of, deep philosophy in Europe, but it wasn't that people had just suddenly stopped functioning.
Right. People just stopped thinking and just had the plague. That's all. That's it. That's the only thing.
Yeah, that was it.
But and I think it's also interesting because a term that we hear pretty often in the U.S. is Judeo-Christian, right? Which was actually a term that was first used by an Irish missionary who dedicated much of his life to converting Jews to Christianity. And the idea was to ensure that there wouldn't be any more Jews left, which is kind of the idea behind Christian Zionism, right? To get all the Jews into the Holy Land so that they can either convert or be consumed by hellfire. I'm not kidding, folks. This is actually what they want to happen. And I bring this up not to throw all Christians under the bus, but to point out that the idea that what's going on in the Middle East is somehow this inevitable and insurmountable fight between Muslims and Jews because they've always hated each other and they're always going to be at odds is just so grotesquely ahistorical and a purposeful erasure, as we've noted. It's a whitewashing of settler colonialism and of violent white supremacist imperialism. In a way that suggests, ironically, that both Jews and Muslims are just savage and will end up killing each other off. And that'll be A-okay again, because Christian Zionists are like, we'd like to get rid of all of you. So Jewish Zionists don't really see that they're being the useful idiots of an anti-Semitic, as in both anti-Muslim and anti-Jewish ideology that goes back centuries. And I wanted to kind of fast forward now, and I hate doing this because I'm a history nerd and I want to hang out in the past, but I wanted to look at this red thread that you've talked about because you're the first person that I've heard that actually makes this connection, that takes the Crusades from nearly 1,000 years ago to the First World War, and then of course to the War on Terror. And I was wondering, could you talk a little bit about that and how the ideologies driving this violence are different and indeed very, very similar in how they operate and how they're perceived by those committing that violence?
Yeah. So one of the interesting things about the end of the First World War was, even before the First World War happened, the British and the French sat down and they agreed with Sykes-Picot, which is an agreement on how they're going to divide up not just the Ottoman Empire, but also Persia. And it it included, Italian cooperation, Greek cooperation, Russian cooperation, but they never actually consulted the Italians, the Greeks, and the Russians. And it was a deal between the French and the British, and the assumption was the other guys would go along with it. And Constantinople, so the Thracian part of Turkey, that was going to go to Russia. And then Izmir and that part of Turkey was going to go to Greece, and then Antalya, the southern coast of Turkey, was going to go to Italy. And then initially the idea was that Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq would go to France, and then the British would take Jordan, and they would get and Palestine, and they would get the southern half of Persia, and then the northern half of Persia was going to go to the Russian Empire. And that was the breakdown. And then Russia, of course, ruins everything by having a communist revolution and says, no, we don't believe in imperialism, you guys are evil, and then immediately reabsorbs all the breakaway states that had left the Russian Empire and does an imperialist thing anyway. Oops, a little hypocrisy, I guess. It happens. Nobody's perfect, not even Stalin. So the British come back to the French, and they're like, well, if the Russians are going to take the northern half of Persia, we can't take the southern half. So that means we're missing our piece. So we want compensation. We're taking Iraq. And the French were not in a position to negotiate. So the French lost Iraq. That went to the British instead. And the reason the British wanted southern Iran was because there was oil there. They knew there was oil in Iraq. So that was the trade-off. The French, there is a little bit of oil in Syria, but nothing compared to Iraq. So that was the deal. The Arabs did a rebellion, and they captured Palestine and Syria. The British ran up the coast, but like Jerusalem and Damascus, the major cities were taken by the Arab revolt. And the Arabs actually created a kingdom that was Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, and the western part of what is today Saudi Arabia, the Hejaz Mountains. And when they made this kingdom, they made their capital Damascus. But then in France, as the Turks are surrendering, the British and the French do ex-Pico as part of the Turkish surrender treaty. And in the process, they invade Syria. And in 1920, there's a battle called the Battle of Maysalun, and the Arab army is defeated by the French army. One of the French generals then goes to Saladin's tomb, and he kicks it. And he says, we're back, Saladin. So, at least in the mind of Henri Giroud, the French general in that moment, this was the Crusades comeback. And to see it in any other way is kind of foolish, because why were they so obsessed with taking Jerusalem, for example? And in a way, it's not quite the borders that the Crusader states were, but it's close. Lebanon is much of the Crusader state, and then Palestine, another big chunk. The part of the part of Syria that touches the coast, and then Antioch, which is in Turkey today, but it was originally going to go to the French. The French gifted it to the Turks because it was theirs to give away, of course. So in a way, the French kind of got the fulfillment of the dream of the Crusades, because they never captured Aleppo and Damascus. That was the dream. And so in a weird way, Syria was this fulfillment. And then, of course, the British end up with Iraq. That was never part of the dream, but they already had Egypt, which was part of the Crusader dream. So all the Crusader goals were fully achieved in the aftermath of World War I. And so that's that linkage. Certainly, the creation of Israel was not what the British wanted, because they wanted Palestine. They knew that was no longer on the table. And they went and voted to create a Palestine. They were going to give Palestine 45% of land, or Israel 55% of land. The Israelis legally owned 5% of the land. So this was a giant gifting event to a population of people who didn't legally own land. And then I'm still trying to figure out why they didn't create a single secular state and just build in safeguards. Like, don't get me wrong, there's a lot wrong with the Lebanese constitution, But there's ways in which you could have created a constitution that made it so that the Jewish population felt protected and safe and had as many rights as everybody else. There was no reason to create a Jewish-only state. And then Palestine was not meant to be Muslim only. It was meant to be Christian, Jewish, and Muslim. So there was going to be a secular state and then a Jewish-only state. But what the British decided was their goal was, okay, if we can't stop Israel from being created, we'll at least stop Palestine from being created. And so they did everything they could to undermine the Palestinian state from being formed. And then, of course, Israel attacked. So we didn't end up with the borders that were created by the UN. Israel ended up with 78% of the land, not 55% of the land. And then, so in many ways, Israel was sort of like okay, we didn't get the full Crusader dream. This is our second option. But what you were saying earlier about kind of Christian Zionists, at the same time they could fulfill their anti-Semitic goals of getting the Jewish population out of Europe and the United States. And so it was like this perfect dream. They'll kill Semites, since Arabs are Semites. They'll be killed in the process, and they're not in our country anymore. And then they'll trigger Armageddon because they've interpreted the Battle of Armageddon. By the way, took place 3,500 years ago, and it's spoiler alert. He's won it. The commander was the pharaoh Thutmose III. So you're waiting for a battle that took place 3,500 years ago. Like, I don't know what to tell you at that point.
There's another thing that when I've been listening to you talk, there's just this, speaking of sarcasm and idiocracy, what I feel like is so clear, another red thread is just the anti-intellectual, brute force culture, a violent terrorist culture overtaking a culture of science, philosophy, scientific method, genuine intellectual curiosity. And I'm not trying to sugarcoat and make it like this flat and monolithic idea, but it just seems to be like this very much, you have like George Bush talking about how it's the next crusade and also sending an army in without understanding Iraqi politics or anything like that. And at the same time, you had the Crusaders being like, I don't know what's going on, but we're going. It just feels like so like rinse and repeat. Like, how is it that we have held on so tightly to this anti-intellectual culture of violence?
What's really weird, it felt like for a while, maybe I'm misinterpreting this, but in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, there was the period of embracing the intellectualism. Like we were inventors. We were innovators. We were trying to do things. Like we had Bell Labs. And the idea was that you would have a job where you would employ people who were really smart, who would think of the problems that we were facing, and they would put notes on the board. And then you'd go to the board to see if there was a problem that interested you, and then you just go try to solve it. Like that's amazing, right? Who doesn't want a society that functions like that? And then you're right. Like beginning in the 70s, there was suddenly this backlash against intellectualism, and all of a sudden there's all these born again Christians, and the next thing you know, we're in the Third Great Awakening. And, they're talking about the moral majority and how the United States has gone down this awful path. And there's rhetoric about how every time something goes bad, whether it's because there's gay people. And you're thinking, what's talking about? One of the things that I find fascinating about it is how many of those Christian fundamentalists who believe that now were hippies, wearing tie-dye and buckskin jackets, smoking pot, protesting against the Vietnam War, and talking about civil rights. And now they're all dreaming about Gilead, and they want fertile women to wear red so they can rape them. And I'm like, how did we get here? What is wrong? Like, maybe there is cripping in the water. Maybe they're right. Maybe we need to rethink this. It just sounds so stupid that there's nothing in the water.
It would make it so much easier if we could just use a Brita to fix all our problems.
Exactly.